My name is Shalene Jobin. I'm so honored to be here today. And it's a real honor listening a little bit before. I grew up hearing stories of Harry Daniels, and I think it was Harry the dog, and stories of my parents' wedding in Ottawa, and the crazy fun stories that my dad tried not to tell me, but I hear about sometimes. And so it's such an honor to be here and just hear the passion and the love, the sigitoin that I hear in this room today, and just honoring people. And I think those that have passed on would be so honored that we're doing this today. At this point, I want to move on to the second session. It's called Political Responses. And first of all, we need to give Margaret Fro has sent her regrets, the President of the Métis Nation of Ontario. She's not able to be here today, but we have the honor of having Will Goodon and Gerald Cunningham that are here. And first of all, we're going to have President Gerald Cunningham speak. And Gerald, I've gotten to know over the last little bit, and I've been so warmed and impressed by his leadership style, and also how he's living out those principles that we heard Elder Maria Campbell talk about. So, for example, he's the president of the Métis Settlements General Council. He also has 3 of his own biological children, and him and his beautiful wife, they've also raised 29 children from foster care. So it's really amazing to see a man like this who his family, they're trying to balance out those political aspirations as well as the aspirations of raising strong community members. So at this point, I'd like all of us to warmly welcome President Gerald Cunningham.
Thank you very much, Shalene. And good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today on behalf of the Métis Settlements General Council at this conference. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge all the elders and the seniors that are here today, and as well as the settlement leadership that is here today. It's good to see you all. And I'd like to thank the elders and the seniors for their continued wisdom and guidance. I'd also like to thank our Métis elder, Elmer Ghostkeeper, for the prayer this morning. Thank you, Elmer. We should also thank the organizers of this conference, because it allows us to engage in meaningful discussions during a pivotal moment in our Métis history. And today I'm going to be speaking about the Métis Settlements General Council's involvement in the Daniels case and the steps that we are taking to advance our Métis rights in light of its decision. Before I do that, I want to share some brief history of the Métis settlements. I know you've heard some of it already. Helmer provided you with some briefing, so some of it might be repetitious, but it's always good to hear the history. So following the Battle of Batoche and the mass displacement of our ancestors, many Métis families sought refuge further west from the encroaching Canadian settlers. And the church, along with several Métis families, that were led in part by Father Lacombe, petitioned the federal government for the establishment of a colony territory to be set aside for the use of the Métis. In 1895, the colony of St. Paul de Métis was created, and just 3 years later, there were upwards of 50 Métis families living there. Unfortunately, after about a decade, the managing board of clergy and federal government officials made the decision to declare the colony unsuccessful because it was unable to assimilate the Métis quickly or efficiently. The church said that the Métis families were unable to learn the necessary skills for agricultural development because they would not give up their traditional ways of cultivating foods and medicines. As a result, the government of Canada opened the lands for public homesteading, effectively ousting the Métis families in favor of French Canadian settlers who began to register claims over most of the lands. The Métis were forced to leave once again, largely left to live on the road allowances, like you've heard a number of times this morning. Our oral tradition reminds us of this harsh time when we, the road allowance people, had no home. At the beginning of the 20th century, a Métis man named Charlie Delorme went to Fishing Lake, hoping to end the struggle for the road allowance people. Charlie was a skilled grassroots leader, but he had no formal education. He lacked the skills needed to engage with the newly created province of Alberta himself. Instead, he relied on his ability to organize others and was able to coordinate other Métis leaders, like Julian Desjardins, to find other Métis families and bring them to Fishing Lake. With word that Charlie was creating a new colony for the Métis, J.F. Dion, a school teacher, writer, and political activist, familiar with the plight that had befallen the Métis people following the closure of the St. Paul de Métis, became a champion for a renewed Métis movement. It took several years for the movement to gain traction, but by the 1930s, Felix Callahoo, Peter Tompkins, Jim Brady, Malcolm Norris, and J.F. Dion came together to ensure that the movement succeeded. In 1932, these men would go on to create the Métis Association of Alberta and the Northwest as a formal group that would represent the Métis people and their demands. They developed quite a reputation, and they were often called the Famous Five, or the Big Five. They were firmly committed to creating a Métis homeland. And largely due to the efforts of the Big Five, in 1934, the government of Alberta established the UN Commission to look into and address the issues and concerns of the Métis. This commission was very important because it was the first time that Alberta recognized that the situation with the Métis was dire and that action was required. And although the action was not all that was hoped for, it did address some of the Métis demands for land and social welfare programs. In 1938, only 4 years after the establishment of the UN Commission, and with pressure from the Métis settlers, the government of Alberta established the Métis Betterment Act. The act was a negotiated agreement that recognized 12 Métis colonies and acted upon some of our recommendations for local self-government. These Métis colonies would continue to grow and allow for Métis culture to flourish. But the Betterment Act provided no protection of these lands, and between the years of 1940 and 1960, the government of Alberta would rescind and dissolve 4 of them: Touchwood, Marlborough, Coal Lake, and Wolf Lake. The Métis settlers resolved never to let another of their colonies be taken away again and continued to push Alberta on measures to advance the Métis cause. So in 1975, concerned that their pleas were falling on deaf ears, settlement leaders Adrian Hope, Maurice Larondel, Lawrence Desjardins, Sam Johnson, and Richard Poitras established the Alberta Federation of Métis Settlements. And you heard Elmer Gosker played a big part in a lot of that stuff in that history as well. We thank you for that, Elmer. So dubbed the Fathers of the Federation, these men went on to address some of the many outstanding issues between the Métis settlements and the Crown in the right of Alberta. In 1985, the Federation of Métis Settlements and the province negotiated a process for protection of our settlement lands. A resolution 18, was passed, committing the province to transfer land title to the Métis of the settlements and to constitutionally protect those lands by means of an amendment to the Alberta Act. In 1989, the Métis settlements and the Crown in the right of Alberta signed the Métis Settlements Alberta Accord, which would come to pass into legislation, the Métis Settlements Act of 1990. And throughout our unique history, gifted to us by our ancestors, we have always pursued the goals of autonomy, self-reliance, and self-government. And this brings us to our involvement in the Daniels case. In Daniels, the Supreme Court confirmed Canada has primary responsibility to make laws in relation to the Métis and non-status Indians, just like it does for the other distinct Indigenous people of Canada. The Supreme Court preferred an inclusive view of Canada's jurisdiction, not limiting Métis to the Powell test, and the court encouraged Canada, the provinces, and the Métis to work cooperatively in advancing reconciliation. In my view, these aspects of the Daniels decision were major accomplishments for Métis people and communities across Canada. The Métis Settlements General Council intervened at the Federal Court of Appeal and at the Supreme Court of Canada to advance these ideas. Given our unique history and legislation, the Métis Settlements General Council involvement was focused on three main areas. One, that our provincial legislation remains valid. At all levels of court, Canada argued that if Canada was found to have jurisdiction over the Métis, our Accord legislation would be at risk of being legally invalid or ultra vires. Métis Settlements General Council was the only intervener that could step in and protect our legislation while keeping the door open with Canada. We made arguments that the principle of cooperation between governments should be respected by the court. The Supreme Court agreed that it is possible for both the federal and provincial governments to pass legislation in relation to Aboriginal peoples. Second one was we felt that Pauli was too narrow and could have negative effects. Métis Settlements General Council argued that the definition in Pauli was too narrow to define who are Métis for the purposes of Canada's jurisdiction and responsibility. In our view, it was important to leave open the most inclusive view of Métis at this stage, given our history and to ensure unforeseen challenges and priorities could be addressed. Pauli is about harvesting rights. It is not about all aspects of Métis society. The test emphasizes geographic and historic connections that are less relevant when considering education, healthcare, economic development, and other programs. In our case, the Métis colonies drew families from different parts of Alberta decades ago. We saw the possibility that the Métis settlement members who could not easily satisfy the Pauli test could be defined as Métis for purposes of provincial legislation, but not for the purposes of federal jurisdiction. We have also experienced government imposing a narrow and harsh view of Pauli. Therefore, we took the position that there is no reason why an individual's identity as Métis should depend upon where they live. The question is much more complex and should be considered when programs, services, or legislation are being developed, not in the abstract. We also argued that Section 9124 and Section 75 serve different constitutional purposes, and there is no need for the test to be the same. Métis Settlements General Council argued that Pauli was not intended by the Supreme Court to establish one definition of Métis for all purposes. Because of the many practical implications of a narrow definition of Métis for Métis families in Alberta and across the country, we celebrate the Supreme Court's decision to leave the door open on this issue so that Canada, the provinces, and Métis governments could work together to define the next step. The third thing was that Métis have the right to define themselves. And this brings me to our final submission that the Métis are unique and distinct Aboriginal peoples who hold the primary right and responsibility to define themselves. Further, we argue that existing definitions of Métis developed by Métis collectives should be respected and adopted by Parliament, especially where those definitions were negotiated between government and Métis. This is an important aspect of self-determination and self-government. We were encouraged that the Supreme Court did not prescribe an unnecessarily narrow definition of Métis, instead leaving the process of refining the definition to us, depending on our unique needs and circumstances. In court, Canada argued the court's ruling would have no practical utility. In other words, even if Métis were found to be included within Section 9124, Canada had no obligations to us. Although Daniels was about clarifying the jurisdictional issue, the Supreme Court ruling opens the door for negotiations of Section 35 Métis rights. One of the primary objectives of the Métis Settlements Alberta Accord was to achieve federal recognition and protection for the Métis settlement lands. However, in the 1990s, there was no appetite from the federal government to be involved in the accord negotiations. Instead, we achieved a compromise with Alberta to protect our Métis land base through the Alberta Constitution, and we left open the door to pursue Canada at a future date. So by clarifying Canada's primary responsibility to Métis, Daniels allows us to build on this momentum and come to the table with Canada. And we look forward to tripartite discussions between Alberta, Canada, and the Métis Settlements General Council to achieve long-standing goals of protection of the Métis settlements at the federal level, and to achieve equity with other Indigenous peoples in terms of federal programs and funding. In the post-Daniels world, we have a unique opportunity to create a new model for engagement between the Crown and Indigenous people that is not built on colonialism, but rather on a government-to-government relationship. We recognize there may be some theoretical debates regarding the positives and negatives of the Daniels decision. From our perspective, the Daniels decision is a positive one. The court chose not to split hairs about definitions and instead chose an inclusive and pragmatic approach that, in our view, has great potential to improve the lives of Métis individuals and communities all across Canada. As the important work is done to determine the outcomes of Daniels, it should not be forgotten that real people are impacted in real ways. So, what have we done so far in terms of working towards those principles of autonomy, self-reliance, and self-governance of our lands given Daniels? Following the decision, the Métis settlements have been working hard to inform our people of what implications the ruling may have for the Métis settlements and for our collective interests. In November of last year, we hosted a historic Métis Settlement Strategic Summit at the River Cree Resort. Delegations from all 8 Métis settlements attended, and the summit had several main objectives: to increase public awareness of key information pertaining to our Métis rights, to create dialogue with our elders and youth through activities and workshops, and to gain input from the Métis settlements delegations for the purposes of information on immediate, short-term, mid-term, and long-term needs, and to collect information, directives, and mandates from our public that will assist in the creation of a strategic framework that is aimed at protecting and advancing our Métis rights in Section 35 and beyond. The summit will be the foundation to our consultation with our citizens as we plan to tour all of our Métis settlements in the coming months to further gain input from our people. What we did was we had the 40 councillors at this summit. We invited 5 elders and 5 youth from each of the Métis settlements. But there's always the group in between those ages that are always missed out on these consultations. So we're going to make it a priority to make sure that we tour the settlements, and we'll go out and have public meetings so that we can get input from everybody. It's important to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to have their say and provide input as we start to work on these and negotiating for their rights. So the summit, like I said, will be the foundation to our consultation with our citizens, and we are going to be doing these tours. So we've also taken the initiative to engage with Canada and hope to soon start negotiating our Section 35 rights. We've hired a Director of Public Affairs, Mr. Blake Deserly, sitting here in the front. He's a young gentleman from the Fishing Lake Métis settlement. And the intent is to start to establish our presence in Ottawa and to work with the federal government in establishing a relationship for future negotiations. So in summary, it is our position that the decision of the Supreme Court of Canada in Daniels does not have the effect of making Métis into Indians or Indians into Métis. And while the Supreme Court of Canada decision means that Canada has primary jurisdiction to pass legislation in relation to the Métis, in the same way that Canada has primary jurisdiction to pass legislation in relation to the Indian and Inuit peoples, Canada has not yet passed any such legislation. Therefore, no federal legislation currently exists that the Métis Settlements Act or other Métis legislation could conflict with, or that could render the Métis Settlements Act or the other Métis legislation invalid. So today I am here as the President of the Métis Settlements General Council, which is the political governing body of the 8 Métis settlements in Alberta. And we have made it very clear through correspondence with the Prime Minister of Canada, through correspondence with the Minister of INAC, and during face-to-face meetings with the Minister of INAC, that there is no other body or organization, whether provincially or nationally, that speaks on behalf of the Métis settlements. As I mentioned at this point, we are the only legislated land-based Métis in Canada. We are established through our own negotiated legislation, not the Societies Act legislation like most other Métis groups. And I say this not to be disrespectful to the Métis Nation of Alberta or to the Métis National Council, but I say this because everybody needs to understand that there are 2 Métis organizations in Alberta. The Métis Nation of Alberta represent the off-settlement Métis. The Métis Settlements General Council represents the land-based Métis. I have discussions with Audrey in the past, and we have agreed that we will get together and work on the common issues, things that affect all Métis in Alberta. But there are Métis Nation of Alberta specific issues that they will deal with, and there's Métis settlement specific issues that we will deal with. So everybody needs to understand that and respect that. So we are hopeful that the Crown, in the right of Canada, will honor their commitment and the statements that they made, that they will build a renewed relationship with all Indigenous people and not just with certain groups. A relationship built on mutual respect. So in closing, I just want to recognize the work of our ancestors for gifting us with the inheritance of land. And we will continue to pursue protection of our lands through the Constitution of Canada in order to preserve for our children and for our grandchildren their inheritance, a Métis land. So I would once again like to thank the organizers for inviting the Métis Settlements General Council to be a part of this conference, and I hope that you will enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you. And I really have to apologize here. I've got a medical appointment that I have to rush off to, and so I'm going to be leaving here right away. But I've asked Mr. Blake Desjardins to join Will up here for any questions that might be asked about what I've just said. But I will be returning as soon as my medical appointment is done, so if you want to speak to me when I get back, I will be back. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, President Cunningham. At this time, I'd like to invite Will Goodon to come and speak. He has built his career with a combination of community service and entrepreneurship. Tutored by his parents to look for opportunities in business, Will also seized the calling of working for the Métis Nation in the Métis government. He started working with the Manitoba Métis Federation in 1996. In June of 2014, Will was elected to the Métis government in Manitoba, the Manitoba Métis Federation, as a provincial board representative for the Southwest region. President Chartrand has subsequently appointed him as Minister of Housing and Property Management. Please welcome Will.
Thank you very much. My name is Will Goodon, as I was already introduced, and I have one of the things that I have been fortunate to do in the last several years, probably 10 years, is to chair meetings. And it usually takes me a few minutes to feel comfortable in front of a group. This is a fantastic group here today, and I just wanted to let you know that you scare the heck out of me. So thank you very much. I appreciate the vote of confidence. I'm very honored to be here today. I also want to say thank you to the panel that opened this morning, Tony, Maria, Gabriel, and of course Elmer. You guys did a fantastic job and really did a good way of opening it up for us to get the juices flowing and to get the conversation going. I also wanted to say thank you to Chris and Kim from last night. They did a fantastic keynote speeches for us on a few issues that also sparked some conversation, and I'm sure will spark some thoughts for us here as we go through the conference here the next couple of days. Before I go too far, I also want to give a special recognition to our elders. It's our tradition to do so, and I want to carry on that tradition to say thank you to Elmer for your blessing here this morning. I also had a chance to meet with I met a couple of new friends here this morning. When I was having my coffee, we got here a little bit early, and I chatted with a couple of ladies from Alberta who is interesting because one of the things that I find that always happens when you meet another Métis person, and it was almost an automatic response when we sat down and talked to them. They asked me who my grandma was, and they asked me who my grandpa was. They wanted to know where I come from and how I fit in with everybody around here. So we already found out that we're cousins through Cuthbert Grant, but I thought it was really a positive thing for me to sit down and feel comfortable, and I just wanted to say thank you very much for doing that with me this morning. I am a Métis person from Manitoba. I come from the Turtle Mountains in Manitoba. My grandma, since we're talking about grandma and grandpas, my grandma was from the American side, from Dunseith area. My grandpa was from the Canadian side. Back in those days, there was no border, really, no boundary on the North Dakota-Manitoba border, and they would go back and forth. They lived in North Dakota for a while, they lived in Manitoba for a while, and while they were living in Manitoba is when my father was born, so he's a Canadian citizen. Today I come to you as a representative of the Manitoba Métis Federation, the Métis government in Manitoba. And I just wanted to say also a thank you to the organizers for this weekend's events. I've been to a couple of Daniel's conferences. They were mostly legal conferences. One was in Toronto at Osgood Hall, and one was in Ottawa, I believe, at the Pacific Business Legal Institute. So I picked up a little bit of lingo, a little bit of understanding, but what I want to talk about today is more about some of the context of how we in Manitoba feel the Daniels case, how it represents itself, and how it brings together more than just one thing and one narrow little focus. Before I go on, though, I didn't know Harry Daniels. I met him once. He was a chairperson at one of our assemblies in Manitoba, but I got to hang around with lots of people who knew him. And to say that he was larger than life was definitely impressed upon me. And I'm not sure if Gabriel, just wanted to say thank you for all your dad's contributions. And it's obviously something very spectacular to get this many people here to listen to one of his accomplishments in his fantastic life. My presentation is going to be broken down into a few different parts. Firstly, want to talk about the legal and political context in what we have going around here and what happened around the time of the Supreme Court decision for the Daniels case. I also want to say that this presentation was done for me, not by me. So if I do a couple of missteps in there, it's purely all my fault and not the fault of the people who did the presentation for me. Secondly, we're going to talk about the declaration and why we have a declaration. Just going to grab my water. Thirdly, we'll do a little bit of analysis. And fourth, we'd like to do some next steps and what we're going to be doing moving forward. Again, this was done for me. So one of the things that the fellow who normally does his presentation, he is very, I'm not sure if the right word is loquacious. He likes to talk. He uses big words. So one of the things that we put together here was the context of what happens, of what is happening in sort of the legal and political context of what's going on with Daniels. As you can see, there's a lot going on. One of the three of the big ones that we want to focus on today is obviously Daniels' case, but how it also fits in with the MMF land claims case. Of course, there's the Powley case, and quite a few other things that have been happening, including what happened in the last federal election, their campaign, the mandate letters that the Prime Minister gave to his cabinet. Tom Isaac is here somewhere, and I know his report has had quite a bit of influence on what the interpretations of what's been going on with all of these different things. There's the Doug Eifert report, the Peltier report. There's also in 2003, Ernie Blais was also charged with hunting without a license, and he went to the Supreme Court at the same time as Powley, and there's some issues and statements inside of the Blais case that also help us understand a little bit of what's been going on. Of course, we have the Kelowna Accord, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We also have something in Manitoba called the Manitoba Métis Policy, which is a blueprint, if you will, of how the Métis government and the provincial government work together on issues of mutual moving forward. We have, of course, the 1992 Accord, the 2008 Protocol, the Cunningham case, the Royal Commission. I'm not sure if I hit all of them, but you get an understanding that there's more going on than just one or two or three cases. There's quite a bit of activity. So we go to the Blais case, and one of the things a lot of people consider the Blais case to be a loss because it said that Métis did not have the right to hunt according to the Natural Resource Transfer Agreements. So in other words, Métis were not Indians at that time in the 1930s. But there were a couple of statements inside Blais that I think are important to look at, and one of them being that the Métis, the Manitoba Métis, were not considered wards of the Crown. This was true from both from the perspective of the Crown and from the perspective of the Métis. And it also said that the Métis were negotiating partners into the entry of Manitoba into Confederation. So we look at the word partner, And we look at what the Oxford and Webster Dictionary says about partner, and it's a person who takes part in an undertaking with another or others, especially in a business or firm with shared risks and profits. So in other words, when the Manitoba Métis and Canada entered into negotiations and into confederation together, that there were shared risks and profits, that they would participate in an activity with another person. So that the Manitoba Métis were more than just wards of the state, as Blaise said that they were not, but that they were partners in the Confederation process. Another word that we have been hearing lots in the last couple of years from our federal politicians, our provincial politicians, is the word reconciliation. In the case of the Manitoba Métis Federation versus Canada, it states that being the Manitoba Act, Section 31, is a collective claim for the purpose of reconciliation between the descendants of the Métis people of the Red River Valley and Canada. The ultimate purpose of the Honour of the Crown is the reconciliation of pre-existing Aboriginal societies and the assertion of Crown sovereignty. So if we go again back to our friendly dictionary, we can look at the word reconciliation and see that one of the definitions is the restoration of friendly relations. So that means that there's obviously a disruption in the friendly relations between the Métis and Canada, and one of the things that the Supreme Court was pushing forward on is to say that reconciliation needs to happen, and the restart of friendly relations needs to happen again between between Canada and the Manitoba Métis. And this is what most of us have been talking about for the last little while, and I'm sure that we're going to hear quite a bit over the next few hours, is Section 9124. Since nobody has put it up there yet, I'm going to put it up on the PowerPoint, and it talks about legislative authority. And the legislative authority for the Parliament of Canada includes Indians in lands reserved for Indians. Not even sure which slide I'm on here. I'm supposed to be reading my notes. So the declaration, declaration number 1, that the idea of Indians, that a broad understanding of Indians under Section 9124 would come to mean Aboriginal peoples, and that Métis are Indians under Section 9124, and it is the federal government to whom they can turn. One of the things, I'm not sure if you can see that slide very well, I apologize for that, but one of the things that that the federal court stated before the Daniels decision went to the Supreme Court was that that they would restate the declaration as proposed by the Manitoba Métis Federation. And the Supreme Court of Canada also said that the Métis Nation was crucial in Confederation, which could not have occurred without Métis intercession. And one of the differences between 9124 and Section 35 is who is included as Métis under Section 35 is a prerequisite to holding those rights. Section 9124 serves a very different constitutional purpose. It is about the federal government's relationship with Canada's Aboriginal peoples. And why do we have declarations? In Daniels, the Supreme Court said that governments, both provincial and federal, have denied legislative authority, that the issue of who took responsibility for the Métis had become a jurisdictional wasteland. Some people have called the concept of who's responsible, who has legislative authority over the Métis as a football, where the province throws the football from one side to the federal government and the federal government throws it back. Or other people have called it a hot potato. Not sure if I'm taking any words away from some people who might be presenting later on, but the hot potato is, I don't know if you ever played the game of hot potato where you try to get rid of it as soon as possible, and that seems to be what governments have done. So the purpose of Section 9124 in relation to the broader goals of Confederation also indicates that since 1867, Indians meant all Aboriginal peoples, including Métis. It also said that it would be constitutionally anomalous for the Métis to be the only Aboriginal people to be recognized in Section 35, yet excluded from 9124. The Métis Nation had a unique identity and history whose members included whose members self-identify as separate from Indians. It should not be a bar to inclusion with Section 9124. It also stated that there is no doubt that the Métis are a distinct people recognized in the Manitoba Métis Federation case. And it also stated that the Métis of the Red River settlement are a distinct community. We kind of went over this one already. I'm going to skip down a couple more here. So from Manitoba's perspective, what does Daniels mean? Of course, we're basically saying that that word Indian at that time meant Aboriginal. Métis are not status Indians in the Indian Act. I think that's been said over and over again. And it also, what we say it means is that Canada cannot deny Métis jurisdiction and responsibility. One of the things that we state is that the MMF in Canada, that there's a need for negotiations, and those are happening right now. I know that Tony talked about Audrey going into Ottawa. I think she's there today. She's there Monday, and there's a meeting between the Métis National Council, the different Métis governments throughout the provinces, and they're going to be signing some fairly substantial agreements that, as Tony stated, are going to be about land, they're going to be about self-government, they're going to be about jurisdiction, they're going to be about policies, they're going to be about programs moving forward, and from Manitoba's perspective, we see that as being very, very important. One of the bubbles that, if you remember the bubble slide, one of the bubbles talked about the 2015 campaign where the federal Liberals won the government in Canada. And one of the campaign promises that came out of the campaign was that the federal Liberal Party, if they became the government of Canada, would immediately re-engage in a renewed nation-to-nation process with Indigenous peoples to make progress on issues most important to the Métis Nation. Now, it's very important that we look at this and see that the Métis Nation is specifically included as not separate and not bundled together as with other Aboriginal people, but that the Government of Canada will be meeting on a government-to-government basis with the Métis Nation government. And again, one of the other bubbles was talking about the mandate letters. Now, when Trudeau became Prime Minister and appointed his government, his cabinet, he sent out mandate letters basically outlining what the mandate is for each of his cabinet ministers. 2 minutes left. Okay, that's good because I'm right on time. So basically, one of the things that they talked about in those mandate letters was a renewed nation-to-nation relationship based on rights, recognition, cooperation, and partnership, and an end and a commitment to end the status quo. This is one of the things that I really wanted to touch base on, and we see Daniels as being a part of the context of how we are moving forward. So we've got three pushes, three thrusts, if you will, three coordinated thrusts. Daniels, when it talks about equity in policy and programs. Powley, we see as a way for us to move forward on rights and self-government. And lastly, in Manitoba, we have the Manitoba Métis Federation case, which lays out a way of partnership between the Manitoba Métis and the Government of Canada, and how the lasting place refers to is the way that the Section 31 of the Manitoba Act was supposed to deal with us as Métis people. It was supposed to have a lasting place for us where we would be secure in our homeland. And as we all know, it turns out that that didn't happen. So the negotiations surrounding the Manitoba Métis Federation case, we want to go back to that principle of finding a lasting place for us in Canada. And that's all I have. I think I've finished my 20 minutes. I didn't think I would make it there, but thank you very much, and I really appreciate your attention here tonight, this afternoon.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to open it up for questions or comments. Mr. Joe Blind.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you. Can I pull this up a bit? I come from Buffalo Lake Métis Settlement, and there's a few people that know me here. And I wanted to say a few things if the president would have stuck around. He knew I was going to get up. I think that's why he left. No, just kidding. I'm from the old school. I don't have an academic background, but I went to the University of Hard Knocks, and I graduated, by the way. And I think we have to correct the history of the Métis settlements. There's all kinds of academic introductions on it, how they all started, but the Métis settlement started from the Métis Nation itself. There was Métis people who started those settlements back in the 30s. And in 1980, sometimes in the early part of the 80s, I was the vice president to the late Stan Daniels when Adrian Hope and a whole bunch of settlement members came in and asking us for money to help start the federation at the time. And of course, we said we weren't going to say no because we knew that the settlements were all Métis people. And we agreed to do that, but and when we did make a motion to give them some money, they wanted in excess of $42,000, so we agreed to give them $42,000 out of our budget of the Métis Association at the time, not the Métis Nation. We agreed to give them that $42,000, but we had a little problem. 8 of the board members had to go outside. They couldn't vote on it because they're all from the settlements. If you go back, Tony, you'll remember that majority of the board members came from the settlements because the settlements at that time, as Métis people, were all over the country, and nobody knew that my family was living in Vermilion, Alberta, in a farm someplace working for the farmer. So nobody knew we lived there. And that happened to a lot of Métis people as well, all over the country. But the Métis settlements were contained, so we knew where those Métis were. And that's how they, when you were running for campaigning or something like, you knew where to find them if you went to a Métis settlement. So at that time, we had 8 of the board members, including Adrian Hope on my dad, Ernest House, William Erasmus, and Ernest House, and many others. And by the way, Patra, the one they mentioned earlier from Paddleberry, and Johnson from Paddleberry. And I can't remember, Jack Knife from Elizabeth Colony, and also Lawrence Deserley, which was my adopted brother. And when they came in, 8 of them had to step out so we can vote on that, and that's how they got their initial start. We gave them the money. Lo and behold, after we gave them, but Stan Daniels, and it's still recorded today if you go to the provincial archives and look at, Stan told him at the time, you know what, he said, the provincial government has given me the authority, has given the Métis Nation the authority to represent Métis people of Alberta, here in Alberta. He says, I cannot give that up, he says, because that's given to us to an annual assembly, so I can't let you guys do that, okay? I'll be represented. But I am going to do one thing. I'm going to recommend to the board that I give you guys every opportunity to play politics with us. So therefore, there's 8 Métis settlements existing. I will offer you guys 4 seats in the Métis Nation, 2 from the east and 2 from the west, east, and 2 from the northwest. That's 8 settlements. So that way you'll have 4 board members on the board of the Métis Nation to represent all 8 settlements. Well, lo and behold, right after that, the Federation started, and one of your guest speakers here this morning, Mr. Ghostkeeper, was the president. And he, in turn, wrote a letter that same summer. We were having an assembly in Athabasca, and many of you Métis people will have remembered that time. It was one of the biggest, Tony, you remember that, one of the biggest assemblies we ever had. There was over 20,000 Métis showed up in Athabasca that same year. That's because, thanks to Mr. Ghostkeeper, he wrote to all the settlement members and saying, do not attend that assembly because we're different half-breeds. We don't have to go there. And my mother phoned me and said, Mom, and son, he says, how can we be different? He said, how can you be different from us, from you? He says, you're the vice president, and they don't want us to attend this meeting. Well, it backfired on him, and it happened in such a way that 20,000 Métis showed up in Athabasca that same year at the annual assembly. That was very generous of the Métis Nation to do that, not only give them the money to help them out, because we knew at the time. Now, you guys talk about splitting, you know, white people splitting us. It's us that's splitting each other. It's us, because there's so many politically ambitious young people after that. It was the old people with their simple ways of dealing with people that made it possible for us to get together before. Adrian Hope was great for that, all those old-timers. But it was the young people that later on that came along and wanted to separate, and that's who they're trying to separate today. I live in a settlement. I argue about that all the time. So I just want to set the record straight that we did not separate. It is them later on. And just to prove that, how we're structured in a settlement and politically, we don't elect a president. 8 people elect the president. 8 chairmen elect Mr. Cunningham here, and that's the chairman. That's the only ones that can elect him. And furthermore to that, folks, I want to tell you, in the settlement, you don't elect the chairman. The 5 board members that are elected pick their own chairman out of 5 of them. So when do we get a chance in the settlement to really have a view? I hope he goes for that tour, and I hope he comes to Buffalo Lake, because that's where he's going to have a little stop for a while, because we're going to stop him there to explain that. So, folks, you know, we can talk about this relationship and all we want, where the Métis are going. Unless things like that stop, there ain't going to be no Métis people in the future. And somebody said it right. My friend here, Marie, said, by the way, she's right. You know, there was no Métis before. We were all half-breeds one time. And he mentioned the late Malcolm Norris. That was my uncle through marriage. My uncle, Mr. Frank Norris, his uncle, and he was married to my auntie. So I'm related to that family. But I think that's the way it happened in those early years. And we did everything in those early years and how we wanted to help out with the Métis Nation. We gave them the money, and we also wanted to support them. But now today, we're separated. Now we're dealing. I live in a settlement. I have both cards to prove I'm a bona fide settlement member in Buffalo Lake, where Ghost Keeper, matter of fact, he's my neighbor. I can see him across the lake. One day I'm swimming across and go visit him. But, you know, it's really sad the way they're doing it here in Alberta, because they won't work together. And I don't know why our President, Audrey, and I often encourage her, I say, why don't you meet with all of us? Why don't you call it resolve this problem so we can know where we're starting? Right now we're having a problem. Some people are saying in the settlement, why aren't we getting some attention here from the national level? And I often question that. So if you don't have the voting power in a community, then that's our problem there, because they don't give us the voting power. It's only restricted to a few of them. As a matter of fact, our chairman has been there for 30 some odd years. That gives you an idea why we can't go any further. And by the fact, he's not that good of a chairman either, but he's there. He's got the biggest family in town. So. And that happens too in every damn settlement, I'll tell you. But I do want to share that with you guys, because I was just sitting here and I'm listening to both of them and say, why don't you guys tell the truth? This is a Métis meeting, you know. If you academics want to know the truth, come and talk to the old timers. They'll tell you all about it, and I'm one of them. Hi, hi.
Thank you, Mr. Joe Blind. And one of the things that I'd like to say is working more with the Métis organizations and Métis governments in Alberta is just this importance of Métis public philosophers. And I think of Mr. Joe Blind, and I think of Mr. Ghostkeeper, and just this ability to have this direct democracy, and these debates are important, and they're important issues, and also just a reminder that we need to discuss these important issues with Sagituin, with love underlying it, and the importance of knowing that there are these distinctions, but there are also, as Mr. Blind pointed out, those family relations that we all have with each other, and so to also have that overarching in our talks today, just that respect and that love as we talk about these important things.
Hello, hello. Perfect.
Hello.
Hi, I just want to respond quickly to Mr. Joe there. It's, first of all, thank you so much for those comments. You know, it's we have very active settlement members all over the province and all over the country. And it's, I think, a huge benefit to the work we do to really acknowledge the work that all of our members are doing. And so, Joe, I just want to say thank you for sharing with us your experience at Buffalo Lake and some of the challenges we face, and we have to know that we are working on those things. Democracy isn't an easy thing. We know the Métis settlements were a relatively new being, I guess you could say, legally within the structure of the province and within the structure of the Canadian government. But our goals have always remained the same. You know, we want to be able to protect our land, our local economic self-sufficiencies, and our local autonomy. And what that means in doing that is finding structures politically that can support those goals. And one of them is a democratic process. So how those systems work essentially is the communities decide those policies early on. And it's not at the general council level that they ever get changed unless all of the settlements agree. And that's, the agreement is necessary. So when an election takes place, we see it's open to the public for all councillors, and it's different for each settlement. Some settlements have a direct representation of their chairman, so the people directly vote for them, or the councillors are amongst themselves, vote amongst themselves to elect of themselves a chairman. So it's different in each settlement, but the important part to remember in each settlement is that during the election process, the structure was created in that fashion, a fashion that they understood. And even in some settlements, we're working very hard with the ministry currently to bring more power back to the settlement members. One of those things, for example, is our settlement members have the right to vote on a budget that's approved. They get to see every single dollar before it's spent and where it goes and how it's spent. It's open public information, and that's voted on. So we're working to try to secure that power again for our members. We've come into some conflict with other authorities as to how we do that, but we're going to fix some of those problems. And I just also want to mention again, history is a very important thing to all of us. something that we share in a really intimate way, in a very close sense. We're family. And I want to thank Joe for reminding us of that we have family across this country. We have family outside of provincial borders, outside of the settlements. The settlements are important, however, for the degree that we have to find very careful ways and measures forward in protecting those lands. We have to make sure that we know who our members are, we know who our citizens are, like we've all been saying here today. And when the process is fairly easy when you're involved in those things, the community. Elmer said it himself, for example. He moved from one settlement to another. Typically that's people often say it's difficult to get into a settlement, but it's also very easy when we know who our people are to really share in those in the land. Yes, I just wanted to comment on that. So thank you.
Will, did you?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay.
Yep.
Sir?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. My name is Bill Inge, and I'm the president of the North Slave Métis Alliance in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. We have been involved in litigation for the past, 20 years anyway, and we currently have litigation in the Federal Court of Canada right now against the two levels of the Crown, the federal and territorial, and one of our NWT Métis Nation counterparts for attempting to extinguish our Section 35 Aboriginal rights using a Denny Métis or a Denny-based land claim. But other than that, that's not really the reason I'm up here. I just thought I'd give you some background of who I am. First of all, we're here to discuss the meaning and implications of the Daniels case, and we do indeed owe Harry the Dog Daniels a deep debt that we can never pay for bringing to light the fact that Métis are, in fact, Indians for the purposes of Section 9124. But there's also other Métis leaders in this room we owe a debt to, including Tony Belcourt, who was the Métis Nation of Ontario president that paid for the cost of the Powley case, which proved that Métis are, in fact, have Section 35 rights. And then another person who seems to be quite modest here and is one of our panel members is Will Goodon. Now, Will sitting up there, he didn't put in his biography what his true claim to fame is. Will got for the Métis across Canada a case, and let me just give you some idea. On October 19th, 2004, Will Goodon killed a ring-necked duck. And he did this deliberately to challenge the law in Canada regarding where Métis have an Aboriginal right to hunt. Now, the government of Canada tried to keep Métis to what they called the environs of a Métis settlement, which couldn't be but maybe 5 kilometers in around a community. Will went out quite a long ways from Winnipeg and went and shot a ring-necked duck for us to demonstrate that Métis have a bigger mass a bigger land mass where they exercise their Aboriginal rights. Will's case was won on January the 8th, 2009. It took him 4 years and 2 months to litigate this case. The trial lasted 28 days. He submitted over 500 documents and maps totaling over 5,000 pages. The trial judge called the costs in terms of human resources, time, energy, and financial resources staggering. So, Will, thank you for that. I used your case as a precedent in my case when the Crown attempted in the Northwest Territories to deny us Métis our Aboriginal right to harvest caribou. And they tried to use that kind of a postage stamp mentality to try and keep us from harvesting caribou that's about 300 kilometers from our community of Yellowknife. So with that background, Will, one of the questions I have has to do with the current I guess you can call it the land claim negotiation that the Manitoba Métis Federation is engaged in. And in case you don't know this, this comes out of 30 years of litigation that the Manitoba Métis Federation took on to get the right to have their 1 million acres of land that was promised to them in Confederation under the Manitoba Act realized. Now we owe a debt there because the Supreme Court of Canada elucidated what the honor of the Crown really means. And it certainly is in trying to weasel out and swindle Métis out of their rightful lands. Now, well, the one question I have for you, is it's a curiosity to me, is on what grounds is the government of Canada negotiating that 1 million acres of land? Is it in recognition of Aboriginal title or something else? Thank you.
Well, first of all, Bill, I just wanted to say I'm going to hire you as my PR man because I really appreciate the kind words. As far as your question goes, there may be a couple of people in the room who may have a better understanding of the legal concepts around the whether it's title, but from my understanding, the obligation that was the obligation that the federal government has to the Métis people was based on a constitutional agreement. So the Supreme Court didn't go as far as calling it a treaty, although Louis Riel called it a treaty. We call it a treaty between the Métis and the government of Canada, that we entered into negotiations. So the 1.4 million acres of land was based on that negotiations. So as you know, there was all kinds of reasons why the federal government felt they couldn't and wouldn't and didn't get the land to the Métis people, and that's what the case came out and said basically that the obligation was not met, and that it needs to be the obligation needs to be fulfilled going forward. You know, I'm going to put Tom on the spot here, so hopefully maybe he can mention a couple of minutes of this later on. But I know Jason will be here later on as well, so he's also one who can help out with the understanding of whether title had more to do with it than the actual obligation from the constitutional, as you know, Manitoba Act was a constitutional piece of the Constitution, and that's basically where it comes from. Does that help?
Sort of. But
yeah.
But you know, the issue that I think we're facing as Métis across Canada, vis-a-vis the Daniels case, is it's said now that the Crown has a duty to negotiate with Métis vis-a-vis land.
Right.
But the one issue that I still haven't got a clear understanding is on what basis are they negotiating land? Is it an Aboriginal title or something else? And I don't know what that would be, because I'm of the view that for 149 years, the government of Canada has never recognized Métis as possessing Aboriginal title, and that's one of the hurdles we have to get over. Thank you.
Just as you know, at the beginning of Section 31, it says towards the extinguishment of Indian title. So their title does have a bearing in what this case says. I'm not sure that title is the only thing that is what the case is about.
Yeah, I guess 149 years ago, I don't think they thought that Indian, when they say Indian in the context of the Manitoba Act, they meant Indian as Métis.
Right.
So that's why I'm confused today as to on what basis is the Crown negotiating a land claim with the Manitoba Métis Federation in light of the new law, and we know how to identify those Métis with Section 35 Aboriginal rights for the purposes of reconciliation with Crown sovereignty. And so Métis now have a way to assert their Aboriginal rights, and it's through the Pauli test. But here in this day and age, that language of Indian for the purposes of a land claim back in the 1800s, I don't think bears resonance. So I'm a little confused about that. That's why I put that question to you today. Well,
Okay, thanks, Bill.
So we'll have one more question.
Thank you. Elders and Relations, my name is Bruce Barry, and I've lived on the Buffalo Lake Métis settlement for the last 4 years. So I know Joe Blind and Elmer Ghostkeeper, and I've talked politics with both of them. Elmer Ghostkeeper is a Métis treasurer. Joe Blind is a Métis treasurer. Plus, they were both born shortly after dirt was invented. And some filmmaker will make a film called Grumpy Old Métis Men, and I'd cast both of them. My question is for Blake. I noted that on September the 12th, Kikino Métis settlement got leave to our Court of Appeal here in Alberta to appeal rejection of their membership, which was that they would only accept new members who were born and raised on the settlement. So the settlement is 5% of the 90,000 plus Métis in the province. My question, if you can answer it, Gerald's not here, is it the policy and formal position of the Métis Settlement General Council that any new members should only be those of existing families living on settlements?
Hello. So how that actually plays out is that isn't the position of the Métis Settlements General Council. Currently, the Métis Settlements General Council is an absence of a membership policy or migration policy, which means that each local settlement has those authorities within their community. So the community at a General Assembly of the community, which happens every month in these communities, most of the communities, can bring anything to those meetings, and membership could be one of them. I can tell you that the General Council, however, we're trying to work on uniting the settlements under one membership policy. We're looking to unify the settlements and have one way of identifying first our own members, the citizens that have the right to migrate within those territories, and the establishment of the process of doing that. So hopefully that answers in a little bit. It would be the position of each settlement to make those decisions. And we were hoping to clarify some of those points at the General Council, which those debates have been going on for some time now in terms of membership and how we do that. I do think that the process, most settlements will adopt a General Council policy. We have some debating to do, but it has to be a consensus-based approach to how we deal with membership.
Okay, and quickly, just point of information for everyone. On December 16th and 17th, the Alberta Court of Queen's Bench in the Gift Lake case, and all the heavy hitters are there, the feds and everyone, they are seeking to have the definition of Métis and the right to membership deemed ultra vires, the province, and struck from the Métis Settlement Act. And that will be a game changer. And I just think this is such an exciting time. My family took script in 1892, and I grew up being called half-breed. I think it's a great time to be Métis because we are standing up and, as Ms. Campbell says, no longer living on the road allowances. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. So I think those are good ways to move into lunch and into some food. And I would just like to give a few remarks. One is that at 12:30, please be back at your seats, and we'll have our keynote speaker coming to speak. And then also, for those of you that have elders around you or those that have difficulty with mobility, please offer to get them lunch and tea and coffee. Ixi, and please help yourself outside for lunch.
Thank you very much.